Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Steampunk Rally. In this 2 to 8 player game, you'll be taking on the role of a historical scientist in a very cartoony, whimsical world where you are racing to the finish line throughout the Alps. Along the way, you're going to be drafting cards to make crazy additions to your inventions as they trundle through the Alps, blowing up, falling apart, and shooting ahead. First, I'll go over how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. The first thing that each player needs to do is pick one pilot out of this large pool of scientists and inventors. They will each be driving their racing invention, and you'll notice that all of them are asymmetric from each other. They have different powers on them. You'll notice that each pilot has a secondary card associated with it. Most of them are these racing engines, but not all of them necessarily are. It's good to look at the anatomy of these cards. You'll notice that there are these half-valve symbols that are on them. Now, the way you're going to build your invention is these cards are always going to be orthogonally adjacent to at least one other card, but they also always need to make seals when they are going together. So, for instance, this does not work because we're not putting a seal together. We would need to do this or this in order to have a legal placement. And the orientation does not actually matter because at any point during the game, you can always rip your invention apart and put it back together again in any way you want, and if a couple pieces don't fit, that's fine, you can just discard them if you want to. There are 4 different phases to each turn. You draft, then vent, race, and finally damage. However, I found the best way to show people how to play this game is to skip the first 2, jump right to the race, and I've also fast forwarded a couple turns so I can show you how the racing works, and then I'll explain the rest of the phases. So here we have Nikola Tesla in his invention. The racing phase is just beginning. There are 2 yellow dice available, and they have 3 cogs. So the first thing that everybody does is they all roll all of their dice simultaneously, and in fact, the entire racing phase itself happens simultaneously. All dice in the game represent energy that you're going to use in order to work your inventions. The yellow ones are electricity, the blue are steam, and the red are heat. So right here we have 2 electricity dice that we were able to roll. When we look at our invention, we see lots of little boxes, and these are correlated with the 3 different types of dice. These ones take electricity dice, and these out down here take steam dice. So what we need to do is start putting these dice in there. So first of all, we rolled this 6, which is really good for our step-up transformer. So we can take this die, put it down there, and if we look here, we see this little 2 pips here. That means that we divide the pips of the die that we put down here by 2, and we're going to get that many new electricity dice. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, which means we immediately roll 3 more electricity dice. Now let's grab this 1 and put it into the combustion chamber. You'll notice this has a little star symbol on it instead of having pip values. This means that no matter what die you put down here, you are going to evaluate the right-hand side once. So it's actually best to put low-value dice on the spot, and I'll explain why in just a little bit. So that means we now get a cog and 2 blue steam dice. And we're going to immediately roll those. Looking down at our penny farthing, we see that we can put any blue die on here in order to get 1 movement and 1 yellow electricity die. Well, this 2 is pretty low, so we can put that steam die right on there. We're going to get another electricity die, roll it, and get to use that. And we're going to get to go 1 movement. So we are out here on the board currently, and when we move once, that just pushes us forward on the track, going away from the starting location. We also have the option of putting multiple dice down at the same time. When you activate at the same time with these dice, you sum them up together, so this is 9. And then you see right here, we divide that by 3. We're going to get 3 of these gray movements. When we look at the track over here, we actually have a fork in the road. We can go this way and suffer 3 damage when we go over this mountain, or we could go this way, which is a little more tame, so we could go 1, 2, 3. Unfortunately, in doing so, we've moved across this mountain down here, which has a 2. That means that we immediately go down twice on our damage gauge, and we're either going to need to repair this with cards that have this shield symbol on them, but unfortunately we don't have any of those in our invention right now, which means we're probably just going to take this 2 damage at the end of the round, and I'll show you how that works in just a bit. You may have noticed these cogs here, and they can be used in 2 different ways while you're racing. You can spend them at 1-to-1 to add a single pip to any die you want. So I could discard all 4 of these to make this 2 into a 6. Or you could spend 1 cog to re-roll any 1 die and hope to get better luck. That's definitely a better way to do it. Cogs are obviously pretty great, so Tesla might decide to use his gyrostat, which lets him divide that 6 by 1 and get that many cogs back. So here we go, and you know what? He's not quite done with that. In fact, if you look at Tesla's main pilot card here, you'll see there is this little light bulb symbol, and we have this light bulb. And this can be flipped over once per racing round, and you execute all cards in your area that happen to have this light bulb on it. So he's going to go ahead and do that and use one of these 2 options. You'll see one of them is just get a new electricity die, but we already got a pretty good one. The other one is you can remove any electricity die from your invention and then use that spot again. So you can use this to get rid of this 6 here, plunk a new 6 down on there,
and get 6 more cogs, which is a pretty great thing. At this point, Tesla decides he does not want to use this blue die down here, and that's because this could be any die, and the higher the value of the dice, the harder it's going to be to get rid of those dice from your invention. You're going to be spending cogs to do that, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. And even though he has a bunch of cogs, he decides not to. But before he's done, he has this event card in his hand, and it's called Polymerization, and you see this little shield here. Well, that will help us repair. We were at -2, now we go to -1, and you'll see it has some text down here that says I could discard any number of dice to get that many cogs, so he may as well just get rid of this one and get a new cog. Maybe he probably should have used it here and gone a little bit farther, but this is just a good example of how one racing turn can go. You can go pretty far, and you can do quite a bit for only starting with 2 dice in your area. Once everybody is done with the racing phase, we move on to the damage phase, and at that point, we look at the dials and we see that we are at -1, so we're going to take 1 damage to our invention. That means we have to take one of these pieces of the invention and rip it off entirely. The only card you can't get rid of is your pilot itself, so maybe they'll get rid of this one right here, and you'll notice that the die that was on it also disappears, which is kind of nice. You don't have to worry about that one anymore. Once that's done, it brings us back to 0, and we're fine. If you ever need to take so much damage that you don't have enough to discard, then you actually explode, you fall back in the race to be one behind the last place person, and then you start with just your pilot pod, so you're probably going to not be winning that game. Alright, now it's time to talk about the first half of the turn, which is drafting and then venting. So for the draft phase, each player is going to draw one off of each of these 4 stacks that are sorted into the 4 different card types in the game. There are events, copper pieces, silver pieces, and gold pieces. And now each player will simultaneously choose one of these 4 cards to evaluate this turn. For instance, Tesla might grab this capacitor here, and then they'll pass the rest of the cards according to this icon right here. So currently, they pass them to the player on their clockwise, and you will do that for the rest of this round. Once this full turn is over, this will get flipped over, and you'll be passing in the opposite direction with the next set of 4 cards on the next turn. Once each player has chosen one card, everybody simultaneously activates the card. This one can be used in 3 different ways. First of all, it can be discarded in order to grab 2 blue steam dice from the supply, and these will be rolled and used in the race phase later on this turn. Or they could discard it to get 2 cogs from the supply, but they have a bunch of cogs. Instead, they could just build this directly into their machine. Now you might notice with the valves, you can't do this with the cards. They have to be oriented correctly. But remember what I said earlier, that you can rip your engine apart and put it back together again at any point. So I could actually move this pod down here and then attach the capacitor underneath, and everything is fine. The cardinal rule is that you have to be able to trace a path of completed valves from every card back to the pilot, and we're able to do so at this point. So now each player picks up the remaining 3 cards that they were just passed, and they choose one of these, and we do it again. If you ever grab an event, like this one right here, the cheat event, you flip it over and put it underneath your damage gauge, and then you can use that event card whenever you want to. Although it is good to note that some of these events have a specific phase, like the vent phase for this card, where they must be played. Once the draft phase is complete, we move into the vent phase, and this is the part where you can remove these dice from your system because they are now kind of clogging things up. You can't use this part anymore with that die in there. So what you can do is spend cogs to rid these dice from your system, and each cog will remove 2 pips from a die, which means I can spend this 1 cog to remove this die entirely. This 6 is going to cost 3 cogs because it's 2 pips each, so that could go away. And unfortunately, even though these dice sum up to 9, you're still going to need to spend 3 to get rid of this 5, and then another 2 to get rid of this 4. That 1 remainder from the 5 does not pass over. Once every player has vented all the dice they want to or can from their invention, you finally move on to the race phase, which I've already showed you how it works. I want to show you one more icon, and that is this golden move icon. The ones I showed you before were a gray color. Now, golden movements are smooth movements, which means when you do them, you don't take damage for moving on that spot. So for instance, this cheat card right here says if your invention has fewer than 8 machine parts, you get 1 smooth movement. So I could move from here to here, but I don't have to take the 2 damage on my gauge. Once any player crosses the finish line, that will indicate that the following turn will be the final one of the game. At that point, everybody is going to do their turn, and many people are probably going to cross the finish line, and once all is said and done, the person who is farthest ahead from the pack of people is going to win the game.
So now let's jump into the review for Steampunk Rally, and we'll begin with a few positive points. The first of these relates to the engine building possibilities that are in the game. you really feel like you are assembling this crazy contraption from a thematic perspective, but also from a mechanical one, because what you're oftentimes looking to do is create systems within the parts in your invention that really feed into each other. Maybe you just get a single yellow die, it doesn't matter what it is, you put it down, and it'll spew out 2 blue dice and maybe a cog or something like that. Well, you roll those blue dice and put them on this spot over here, and those 2 dice, depending on their pips, might spew out like 5 or 6 red dice. Okay, well now use those 4 or 5 red dice, and you put them over here, and you put them down here, and maybe one of them spits out another yellow die, and maybe something else let you remove a yellow die, and you put that yellow die back, and you start the whole system again, and you could create these wonderful chains of lots of stuff that you can do with a single die, which I think, from a thematic perspective, makes a lot of sense for the whimsical, cartoonish nature of the game. I mean, obviously, this breaks the laws of thermodynamics by creating more things from small things like 1 die turns into 2 dice, 2 dice turn into 5 dice. That's silly, but it totally matches the ridiculous setting of you guys racing through the Alps with these crazy contraptions falling apart right, left, and center. I really like the way you can assemble these combos with the cards, and it also makes sense how sometimes you take damage and you might have a great piece to your combo, but it's full of 6 dice, and there's no way to get them off without removing tons of cogs. So you lose that piece and try and find a new piece to fit in there. So it's a constantly evolving and changing mechanism within inside your invention, and I just really love the challenge of trying to make the best one that you can. Positive number 2 relates to the 3 different ways that you can play the cards that are in your hand during the draft phase. First of all, you can either put that card down into your machine or underneath your dial if it's an event. Secondarily, you can discard that card for specific energy dice. And the third thing you can do is discard that card for a couple of cogs. And what this does for the player is it gives you lots of short-term versus long-term decisions to make. Sometimes you want to get a machine part because you know you want to put it in your machine and it's not even that great for this moment, but it's just too good. You can't pass it up. It'll be good later on. It might be like a propeller or tread, something that let you get over that huge mountain that's coming up. But the flip side is maybe you really need that color energy dice that are on that card. And if you don't take that card and pass it, maybe the next hand of cards you're going to get is going to have none of those dice. So you need to think, what am I trying to get done this turn versus the future? And also, when you look to the cogs, it's great because sometimes you get a hand of cards and you don't really care about any of them. You don't even really care about the dice. Maybe you pulled enough. It's great that any card can be discarded for a couple of cogs, which you want. They remove dice from your system. They can modify the dice during the racing phase. You can re-roll and add pips to them. Cogs are really good. And this gives you options to just take any card. If you don't like any of them, maybe you try and figure out which one your opponent you're about to pass your hand to wants the most, and you discard that one for cog. So I just love the multiple ways you can use each of these cards, and it means that you pretty much always have something interesting to think about when you're trying to draft a card from your hand. Positive number 3 relates to the way the game mechanically handles the randomness of the energy die rolling in the race phase. I really like it when a game actively tries to make low rolls just as good as high rolls, because you never want the whole game to be, well, I lost because I only rolled low. The way the game tackles it is it has some machine parts just activate once no matter what die you put down in there, which means inherently you want to put low value dice on there so you can spend less cogs to remove it to activate it again. The converse side, you have other pieces in your machine where you want to put the biggest numbers possible because you're going to be dividing that number, and the number of times you can divide it is going to get you movement or strength or all that kind of stuff. So what it does is it incentivizes you to build a balanced machine where you can use high rolls and low rolls. And now it is on you. You could just build a machine that only wants high rolls and then roll the dice and roll low and feel really bad for yourself. But you really don't want to put yourself in that position. There are ways to get around that to make use of the randomness of the dice, and I just really enjoy the way mechanically the game goes about making sure no matter what you roll, there is the possibility for it being good for you. Positive number 4 relates to the pace of the game and how I love how almost all of it is simultaneous. You are doing a drafting phase and you're picking a card and passing it to your opponent on your left or your right, and everybody's thinking at the same moment. This is pretty much the only part of the game where there might actually be downtime. If you have somebody who's having a really tough time figuring out what card they're drafting from their hand, you might have the cards kind of pile up next to them and it slows the game down just a little bit. But beyond that, everything else happens simultaneously. You do the race phase, everybody's rolling the dice, they're activating their machine parts all at the same time, they're moving the machines throughout the track. It has a simultaneous vibe, which is great because it means you can play with lots more people and it won't necessarily slow the game down that much. Now, I will say that for your first game, you'll probably tackle the race phase in turn order for the first couple times to make sure everybody understands it, nobody's accidentally cheating, or they really have an understanding of what's going on, because once you are fully simultaneous, the onus is on the player to make sure they're not screwing up. So I just really enjoy that. Once you finish the racing phase, you pretty much just flip the little disc over, draw new hands, and start drafting again. So you're just constantly in the game, pretty much no matter what the player count is, and I really enjoy that. Now let's shift into a couple of neutral points. And the first of these relates to the amount of player interaction or lack thereof in the game. For the most part, it's a hand drafting game, and that's pretty much where almost all of the interaction with your players is going to happen. Occasionally, you will have a situation where you will take a card and use it or burn it, specifically so that your opponent you're passing your hand to will not get it, so that's a bit of indirect player interaction. But to be honest, from my perspective, I pretty much always selfishly took the card that I needed the most and not even really paid too much attention to the person to my right or left, because usually there's good stuff in your hand and stuff that you really want, and so it does not feel like you're really interacting with your opponents when you're doing the draft phase. And then the actual racing part, your machines are falling apart, they're blowing up, but they're never actually knocking into each other. There's no real interaction on the map, which was a little surprising to me, and I'm totally okay with that, but I want to point that out so that people understand. You might expect that kind of jostling for position and maybe taking damage when you hit each other on the map. None of that actually exists. There are some event cards, a few of the event cards, that will interact with your opponents either positively or negatively, but for the most part, this is a multiplayer solitaire game, and it's important that you understand that going in. And neutral point number 2 has to do with randomness and luck in the game, and I will say that it does present itself. I mentioned before that I really like that they design the mechanics of the dice so that low rolls are good and high rolls are good depending on the situation, but there definitely will be times where you roll like 4 dice and you really need them to be high because of the way you built your engine, and you're going to roll like 1s and 2s and you'd be like, ah, crap, and the person across the table from you rolls perfectly and they just shoot ahead, and randomness can definitely poke its way in. And there are ways to mitigate that. Like I said earlier, you can try to draft and build your engine so that if you do a low roll, you can still do something for it. But then there is the luck of the draw of the cards. You just might not get card options in your hand that will allow you that option to make use of high value rolls and low value rolls. There are times where I'm rolling the dice and I have no problem with the randomness of them, but I feel like I go 2 rounds and I never draft any particularly good cards. Like they just are not working. Like, oh, this is a really great card, and it doesn't synergize with anything I have going on. Or maybe I draft it and then I can never get the dice to discard on the cards to actually activate it. This is not a problem. This is not a negative at all. I just want you to understand that there are these 2 layers of randomness that are in the game, and it does a pretty good job of mitigating that through the mechanics that are there, but you will still probably have moments where you roll the dice or you get the hand of cards and it's really not what you want, but that kind of variance adds a little bit of flavor and whimsy and fun to the game, honestly, because when you get the good luck section, you roll the dice and they're exactly what you want. There, you have that high, you get really excited when you do that, and it's counterbalanced by the lows that happen, but in general, the game usually seems long enough that I don't feel like the person who won because they got luckier. Alright, now let's discuss my one negative for the game, and it's a bit of a soft negative. This relates to the difficulty of teaching the game and the learning curve of the game. I found that it took many games for me to figure out how to teach this game well. So that means the first couple of games, man, I would finish teaching the rules, I'd start at the beginning of a turn, go to the end, and I would get so many blank stares. People just were not getting it. And these are people who get board games. They've done lots of drafting games, but they don't understand why they're drafting, or wait, you're getting dice, but you're not rolling them right now. Wait, why are you doing this? And wait, what are cogs for again? I found that you really need to teach this game halfway through a turn. You start by doing a fake race phase. You build a quick machine in front of you, you roll some dice, and you move your little machine around and show movement, smooth movement, and how you take damage, and then go into the drafting phase. And once I did that, it became a little bit smoother teaching this game, but I will be honest, it's still a bit of a rough teach, and it still takes several turns usually for most people to kind of get what's going on in the game. And by, a few turns in, people do get it, and the game does run smoothly, but it's a little weird. It feels very clunky and awkward the first couple turns. And near the end of the game, when it's humming along at a purr and like everybody's going at the same time and the game's going really quickly, people kind of forget how clunky and awkward that first turn was. But I do want you to know that you're probably going to have some awkward first turns when you're teaching this to new people. So now let's go over the replayability of Steampunk Rally, and I think it's definitely above average for a couple of different reasons. The first of which is the huge number of the historical pilots that you can pick at the beginning of the game. I believe the game comes with 16 of them, and all of them have different powers on them. Now, some of them are quite similar, like one might be like get a red die or a cog or a movement, and another one will be get a blue die or a cog or a movement. Those are very similar, but other ones are quite different, like some have no movement on them at all, some have double movement, some have smooth movement right from the beginning. There's a really good variety, and from a thematic perspective, it's really kind of fun to just pick a different person every single game. Like, that's 16 games worth of people that you can play before doubling back, and by the time you play the same person twice, you'll potentially have played the game so many times that you forgot what it was like to play that person. I will admit that Each gameplay is not that much different depending on the player that you grab, the pilot that you grab, but it will subtly shift the way you draft cards from your hand because they might just automatically give you a couple of yellow dice. Well, you're more predisposed to build an engine that uses yellow energy dice and little things like that I like. There's also a huge amount of cards in the decks that you're drafting from. I will admit, after playing a few games, you do start to feel like you see the same cards over and over again. There's many duplicates of these cards. Specifically, I guess the event stack. That's the one where much more variety comes into play. I think that the way the parts come into your hand and you put them out into your area, that's pretty average, maybe a little bit above average because of the way you can interact those cards together. Like, in one game, you use this card that works great with another one, but that same card can synergize well with something else, and so it really depends on a game-to-game basis. I'm talking about this a little bit too much, but I think, in general, it's got a very solid replayability. Okay, let's discuss the various player counts that Steampunk Rally supports. It is a 2 to 8 player game, which is a really big variety of player counts, and I've played several of them, and my opinion is that the 4-player game plays best. And the reason for that is the minimum number of players such that you will not see any cards in your hand come back around to you during the drafting phase. And to some people, that's actually a problem. I know a lot of people like that part of drafting games where it's going to come back around to them, and some of these cards are going to be options again, and that's going to affect how they're going to draft from their hand. But I think the strength of this game lies in the variety of cards that you see so that you're more likely to find the thing that works for this kooky engine combination that you have going on in your system. So I found in like a 2-player game, you picked a card and pass it over to the person, you got another hand, and that's it. You've seen all the cards for that round, and you're going to pass back and forth until they're all gone. And there was a variety problem there. I felt like we barely even took a dent in those big stacks of cards that you're drafting from. And I also found that at higher player counts, like 5-player and 6-player, you're not getting an additional amount of infusion of variety into the game. You just have more people with a little bit more potential downtime with the drafting. The bigger issue with higher player counts is that awkward beginning. Like, I would strongly advise you not play with more than 4 players if there are even 2 new players to the game. I would love to, I haven't actually played a 6-player game. I played a 5-player game and it worked well. I would love to play a 6 or 7-player game, but everybody has to know the game first. And even then, I feel like 7 and 8 might just be too many players, even if everybody's on the same page, because wow, that's just a lot of chaos happening. But at some point, I hope to try it. So to sum it up, I think that 4 really is best, and 5 played great as well. In conclusion, I've been really impressed with Steampunk Rally. I've had quite a bit of fun playing this, and many people I played it with have really enjoyed it too. It really harnesses that whimsical, kind of goofy race theme, but it has a backbone of strong engine building. I really enjoy trying to make these combos work where you have, one die turn into 2, turn into 3, and have it splinter off, and this thing heals you, and this makes you go fast, and this damages you and has you explode forward. There's great decisions to be made in trying to make these engines, and it's really fun when you get it working and you see all these dice kind of flowing through, and you go really far during the race phase. I really enjoy that. In general, I'm pretty lukewarm to hand drafting games where you have a hand of cards, you pick one, and you pass it to the right or left. But I think it really works for this game to kind of keep the action going with all the simultaneousness, and I really, like I said earlier, enjoy the variety of decisions you have to make with the cards in your hand because you can get cogs or dice or just build new things into your machine. So all in all, it's a really fun game. It's a bit chaotic, but still has some Euro-y engine buildingness. It's got randomness, but the randomness can be mitigated. There's all sorts of really good stuff in this box, and I've had a really good time playing it, so I would definitely recommend it. If you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to my channel. Also, you can directly support the channel at patreon.com/JonGetsGames. Thanks for watching.